So it is good to be back home at Ascension. Even despite, yay! I do have to confess that when I peeked at the gospel, after I said yes to Heather, I thought, oh, maybe I need to find another weekend to go. So one of the great joys of my new call at the Mission to Seafarers is getting to be with seafarers right before they go home. Mariners spend many months aboard their ships at sea, and vacation is a luxury that they do not get, especially in COVID season. And that means that until their contracts are over, all of the seafarers that we encounter and who you see on those container ships that are out in Elliott Bay, all of those seafarers go for months and months without going home. During the pandemic, you and I have had a little bit of that experience as we have all isolated and self-isolated. But even then, I think it is really hard for us to imagine what it would be like, contract after contract after contract, not being able to go home, except for a very short 3-month period of time, occasionally. Now, we never know what to expect on a ship visit, and I've had a couple of conversations with you, those of you who have been interested about that, and I'm going to name that sometimes ship visits turn out well and sometimes they don't. But I am learning something about ship visits, that when seafarers are about ready to go home, they are really easy to spot. There is this glow about them. There is this happiness and this relief that gives them great energy. And they seek us out as ship visitors. They want to come talk to us to share their good news. On Monday, I went aboard a ship in Tacoma. The three of us, our three primary paid ship visitors, all went down to Tacoma. And there was a Filipino engineer who I think right now is on a plane on his way to the Philippines, and their Greek first officer, chief officer, who is leaving from Vancouver. And they immediately found us and told us about their trips home. About a month ago, there were a couple of captains who wanted to stop and talk to me. One was an Indian captain, and he was very excited about his trip home, and he was also worried because his family, who lives in India at that time, were really worried about COVID and were telling him not to come home. And then there was a Turkish captain who I saw, and he actually right down at the grain terminal, the one that's really close to us in Magnolia. And he took it all in stride, except that he fretted because he had gained a whole bunch of weight, and he did not know how he was going to explain this to his family. I assured him it would be fine. So these conversations that seafarers have, I think, are a rehearsal for them. It is a practice for what they are going to tell their family and their friends when they get home about what it has been like these last many months at sea. And I think that those conversations help them process some of what they have experienced. Being a seafarer is hard and grueling work. It is some of the most demanding work that happens on this planet. But being a seafarer in a pandemic adds this entire additional layer of danger that I think very few of us encounter in our day-to-day experiences and certainly in our work. And so when it is time for them to go home, I think that that is when it really starts to hit seafarers. Some of their companions on ships have not been so lucky, and they have not survived the pandemic. But these seafarers finally realize that they will make it out alive this time. They have survived the dangers of sea and the dangers of a pandemic. And I think each one of us is starting to realize that too. We have survived a pandemic. And these seafarers know that they will get to go home to see their families who have worried and fretted for them. They will celebrate, and they will grieve, and they will rest. And that is amazing news. I see why they want to come and tell us this great news about what is happening. It also tells me that homecomings really matter. So today, in the gospel, we hear about this other homecoming. After this long absence away doing the work of God, Jesus finally makes his way from the Sea of Galilee up to Nazareth. And I know some of you have been to Nazareth. You know that it's kind of up a little bit, up on the hillside. But unlike these seafarers, this trip home for Jesus is anything but joyous. It goes sideways almost immediately. So why? Peter Block, who is a writer and a researcher on community development, offers some insight that might be helpful. Block says that based on his experience, communities get stuck. And I think we all know this. We've all been stuck in our own lives, and some of the communities that we have been a part of get stuck. Sometimes communities do it on purpose because there is just too much going on and they need to slow down and do inward reflection. But other communities don't realize that they've stalled. Process or bureaucracy might weigh them down, or leaders might swoop in to make important decisions, or people in the community might expect the leaders to make important decisions. Or, and we know this, many of us, we can just get too busy and we can only see this far rather than far, far beyond the walls of our places of dwelling. Regardless of the reasons, communities that are stuck end up as isolated communities. They are defensive, and stability is prized over change, and trust is expected rather than being earned. And that sounds a lot like this community in Nazareth that Jesus finds when he goes home. They are stuck. They are closed off to something new. They did not want what Jesus brought, at least on that day, they did not. And it's not hard to imagine people sitting in the pews that day with their arms crossed, kind of leaning back, giving everybody, including Jesus, the side eye, saying and wondering why they were there. As one commentator puts it, the hometown crowd, they expected nothing from Jesus, and that's what they got. But here is the deal. I think Jesus knew that that was going to be the response when he went home. After all, his family had already tried to stop him, telling themselves that he had gone mad. And we heard that gospel at the beginning of June. And the religious experts tried to stop him too, telling themselves that he was possessed. Everywhere that Jesus went, it was often the insiders, the ones who knew him best, who were the most resistant to the good news of God. So I don't think it's surprising that the hometown crowd responded. I think they were surprised, and they didn't know what to do. But Jesus went anyway. Like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all of the prophets, he was faithful to the call that God gave him, even if it meant some kind of cold, unexpected reception at home. And that, I think, is the good news for us today. God's way can't and won't be stopped. God does not avoid the hard places or the hardened hearts of humans. While we might be tempted to avoid those, and I will name that I am a conflict avoidant person, and some of you here know that I am a conflict avoidant person, God refuses to give up that easily. Jesus goes home because he knows that God will come near. And he wants his disciples to know this too. Each of us as disciples is called to go to those hard places, those places that sometimes we resist, because that's what God would do, and that's what God calls us to do. It is how God uses each one of us to accomplish this mission of reconciliation and love in the world. It is what it means to put the mission of the church into practice, restoring all people to unity with God and each other through Christ. Those are really nice words, but they are also more than fancy words. They are the mission of the church as defined in our BCP, in our Book of Common Prayer. I don't see one here, but you guys have them in the pews. this mission is calling us to something new now. And it also says that showing up matters. You all are showing up in so many different ways, and you are being called to show up in new ways as you emerge out of the pandemic. At the mission, we have to remind ourselves every day that showing up matters. We never know what to expect on board those ships. Sometimes those visits go really well, like when seafarers tell us about their homecomings. But I will confess that sometimes those visits don't go so well. And 10 minutes after we show up on board the ship, we are back off the ship calling our security escorts to come pick us back up. And when they do, and they are the most amazing people who work at the port, they look at us and they say, "What happened?" And then we talk a little bit about it. And then they say, "Let's go on to the next ship." We, like Jesus and the disciples, just keep going and going and going. And you know about that rhythm in your own lives and in this community as well. You have been doing it so faithfully for many, many years. So there is one more lesson that I think is important on this Independence Day, which is also on a Sunday. Community matters. Block says that community is ultimately about belonging. It is about this container where longing and being are fulfilled. But communities do not just happen. People have to be invited into them authentically, and people have to feel genuinely welcome. And I realized last night as I was reading through this one more time that it is 21 years ago this month that I stepped foot in this place and was welcomed with an incredible, generous spirit and heart. And things have transformed in me and in you in ways that none of us could have expected over those 21 years. Invitation and welcome matter. And communities that are committed to being faithful to healing, especially these wounds that we are working through now as a society, they are places where people live together, collaboratively and creatively with one another, so that that better future can come into being. That is what baptism is about. It is about saying yes to this invitation that God extends to each one of us. And those same healing communities practice something else. They intentionally seek out people who are not used to being with each other, and that is really hard work to do. That includes people who have historically been excluded or marginalized from the conversation, and listening deeply to the stories that they have to tell us, especially those of us who are a part of the dominant society. And 245 years after this Declaration of Independence that helped birth our country into being, it is both a challenge and good news for us to know that we are being invited into these conversations with people who do not look like us, who do not share our own experiences. This American experiment is far from over, and it is also far from perfect. We are stuck like the people in Nazareth, and we are also curious and hopeful people. This 4th of July, honesty and hope also matter. God is at work through all of us in this place, just like God was at work in Palestine 2,000 years ago. God just keeps calling us into this better and more amazing future, one that is filled with justice and hope and love for all people. On this 4th of July, know that good news and discern how you now are being called to be a part of that beloved community to which we are all called.